What is up, everybody? We're doing yet another game review during our series of traveling the old and the new MMORPGs. And today, well, we're breaking down a game that I loved long ago that has continued on, and that is Warhammer Online, Age of Reckoning. Specifically, we're playing on the private server Return of Reckoning. This game originally launched in 2008 under Mythic. The official servers unfortunately shut down years ago, but Return of Reckoning has been running since 2014. That's well over a decade of consistent uptime for a fan-run PvP MMORPG. In fact, I'm pretty sure this server has gone on for longer than the original game did. And well, when we logged in, the server population was pretty good. It ranged between 700 and about 1,200 players. There's about a max cap of 3,500. Which honestly is pretty healthy for a niche PvP focused MMO in 2026. But you can actually go to their website and always see who's online and how many, which I think is actually pretty neat. It gives you a good idea of just what you're jumping into. How about the first 5 minutes or so? Were we confused? Were we confident? Well, I would say that we were confident in what we were doing and the goals that were laid out in front of us. Character creation is very traditional Warhammer fantasy. Races and classes are locked together. So you have things like dwarves and greenskins, dark elves, the high elves. It's clear what you're picking. There are no weird or complicated systems layered on top. You spawn into a classic quest hub. You're asked to kill mobs and to turn in quests, kind of the traditional experience. And when you complete what you're doing, you move on to the next quest hub. It's really old school MMO design, but you know what? It works. The tutorial at the start explains things pretty well. Public quests, realm versus realm, basic skill usage, all that sort of stuff. It's not overwhelming and it's not really system heavy either. And I didn't really have to ask myself, what am I supposed to do right now? I kind of always knew. And for me, that's really a big win as far as introducing the players to the game. Now, here's where things get a little bit interesting. You can completely ignore PvE and level through PvP. In fact, actually, I would almost suggest that for those of you who try out this game. But we rolled an Archmage healer and jumped straight into RVR. The game auto-scales you with your level, so you can contribute pretty much immediately. Now, if you're starting off brand new, you are missing skills and you're missing some gear, but you can still feel pretty impactful in the game. And really that flexibility is pretty huge for somebody that's looking to just jump straight into PvP. All right, moving on to UI and information design. Can you understand the game without really fighting the interface? Yes, I think you can. It's pretty straightforward. UI is super clean, and I have to say I really like it. It's pretty minimal, it's very readable, and it's a pretty enjoyable part of the game that you interact with all the time. A lot of players really have compared it to vanilla WoW while we were playing, and I think that kind of makes sense, given that this is a 2008 era game. The real star, however, for me was the Tome of Knowledge. This thing tracks everything: quests, lore, kill stats, unlockables. It's just a really well done central part to the game in helping you understand what you're doing, where you've been, and what you need to do going forward. Literally everything funnels through this central book interface. It's organized, it's readable, and tooltips are actually pretty helpful. Return of Reckoning also surprisingly supports add-ons, which is a pretty big deal for a game that is being run in a private server fashion. I ran an add-on called Enemy while I was healing as an Archmage, and just to get some better healing frames. And honestly, it made PvP so much better from a healing perspective. It was almost really mandatory. But there are a lot of add-ons that are still in active development, which is, again, pretty surprising and pretty cool. So, there is a lot of customization here, and, there's really not a lot of friction points for the UI. It's done really well. One thing everyone always asks about, well, how about combat? How does it feel? And what's the feedback like? Does it feel good pressing buttons? Yeah, I have to say, I really enjoyed the combat, especially in PvP. Combat is your sort of classic tab-targeted MMO. Auto attack exists, but you're mainly cycling abilities. And the abilities feel good. They feel responsive. They hit well. They register clearly and cleanly. And really, I think you understand when and sort of why you're taking damage, and also how you're dealing damage. Time to kill in PvP is somewhat slow, but I actually think that was pretty good experience. I had some situations I ran into which were pretty difficult, but I was given the ability and time to get out of them, and we did. Some of the RVR battles that we experienced go on for an incredibly long time. Frankly, sometimes almost too long. There's a lot of territory shifts back and forth. And, there can be these really, really fun moments of momentum swings where you can just feel it coming. You can see your teammates coming and the people you're fighting just slowly falling back. And it feels really good in a group PvP setting. So, from a PvP perspective, combat is really, really well done. I really think if you loved this back in 2008, you're going to continue to love it now. So what about build depth and player expression? Well, this is where things get a little bit more limited. It is a class lock system. You are your class. You don't have any sort of weapon swaps and suddenly become something else. There's skill specialization and there's also gear choice, but there really isn't any horizontal progression in any sort of heavy, meaningful way. And what I mean by that is really, two archmages won't feel radically different from each other, no matter really what you do. I will say itemization does matter. So when you get an upgrade, it actually does feel meaningful, which is, super important. So, the depth here I would say is pretty moderate. Expression is really limited within class identity. You're not going to get a lot of freedom here. If you love locked class archetypes, you're really going to enjoy it. If you prefer sandbox builds, this game really isn't that. So now how about progression and the reward cadence? Does the game respect your time? Do you feel like you're progressing well in the time that you're spending? I have to say PvE leveling is steady, but clearly slower than modern MMOs. Quest hubs can feel excessive at times. Some of these NPCs were handing out, 4, 5, 6 quests at once. It was a very, very sort of 2000s design. PvP leveling, though, is again much faster. Your time's going to feel much more respected in that space. We actually hit level 10 on a fresh Archmage just from PvP within just a couple of hours. It was a much faster and frankly, at times probably better progression experience in PvP. But there is some friction points with trying to do that. One of those is warbands, the sort of raid groups that you're in during realm versus realm PvP really cap at 24 players. So if you're not in that group, you are not getting rewards and you're not getting experience. And so solo PvP leveling can kind of feel pretty bad in that sort of setting. But that's really a design tension. I think it's supposed to exist there. They want us to be focused on group play and group combat, especially in the PvP side. But overall, I kept logging back in, excited to grow my character. That's really the live test in all of this, and I have to say it passed. All right, what about world design and exploration? Well, this game is mostly on rails. You're going quest hub to quest hub. There's really not a ton of incentives to wander off the path and go exploring. Zones, they do have identity. I will say, orc versus dwarf war zones, dark elf coasts, this sort of classic Warhammer fantasy aesthetic does exist. I mean, I do enjoy that part. And you have public quests, which do break up the monotony and can encourage cooperation as well, which adds a little bit of depth, which is good. Environmental storytelling, I would say, is pretty light. NPC dialogue is going to carry most of the lore that exists. You're not really going to find it much in the environment. So, it's not a modern open world sandbox. It's a pretty structured war map that you're working your way through with your character. All right, moving on to social friction and cooperation. And I have to say, this is where Warhammer really, really shines. PvE is largely soloable. I don't think that you're coming to Warhammer in order to have any sort of friction from a PvE perspective. PvP, on the other hand, is 100% social. You need communication. You absolutely need communication for things like calling out targets, for defending objectives, for pushing zones. I mentioned add-ons earlier. There actually are some well-functioning add-ons for Return of Reckoning that actually are based on this sort of communication need for your PvP interactions. And then there's the war report system, which really shows hotspots and lets you even teleport into battle every 20 minutes or so. It's really pushing you towards that sort of social friction, communication, cooperation areas of the game. It's intentional. It's really meant to push players together. And, I think this is really where PvP guilds would thrive, is in this game if they really gave it a chance. It's really well done. What about failure and consequences? Well, you know what? Death penalty is pretty light. You respawn, there's a debuff that you get. It does stack, so you can't really ignore it completely. But your main penalty is just going to be time, lost time running back. I have to say, for a PvP heavy MMO, I'm okay with that. It feels appropriate. I think harsh penalties would probably kill a lot of the momentum. And so I'm not so sure that we need anything super, super extensive anyways. All right. How about crafting and the economy? Well, crafting does exist, but it is not at all super deep. You can do things like farm, make potions, break down items. And you can level some crafting skills, but you can only do 2 professions out of the 5. So there is some dependency. I have to say though, straight up, this is not a crafting MMO. It's entirely supplementary and sort of an afterthought. It has its purposes. The UI actually for it is pretty decent. But if you're a crafter, this probably is not the game for you if that's really all you want to do. So what about our sort of final verdict? What are our thoughts here at the end? I have to say, if you're really looking for a PvP focused MMORPG, something that includes, this idea of realm versus realm warfare, you like factions, and you like meaningful territory battles with really fast and quick access to large scale combat, you're going to love Warhammer Online. You really either need to go back to or try out Return of Reckoning. It's done incredibly well from a PvP focus. I have to say, so far of all the games we've played, when I think of the PvP side of things, this has been the best experience I've had. So for those of you who are really looking for that cooperative PvP experience, definitely got to try it out. I mean, it's free, right? It's free. You might as well try it out. Now, if you're someone that wants really deep crafting systems or sort of this idea of a modern open world sandbox exploration type game, or even sort of mythic plus style PvE experiences in the end game, I have to say this just isn't built for that. It's really not for you. And that's okay. There are other games out there that are more PvE focused. But, if you love Warhammer and you love PvP, this is just a really, really, really good game. For me, this is a game I will likely come back to over and over again for the sort of PvP RVR experience. I could very easily sink 20, 30, 40 hours into this game. It's a lot of fun. So, and again, what do you have to lose? It's free. You might as well check it out. The only thing you really have to lose is your time. And I don't think you will feel like you lost anything if you do enjoy PvP. So I appreciate y'all watching. Again, this is Warhammer Online, Return of Reckoning. I'll put the link to the client in the description, so go check them out. And what are we playing next time?